What is something about yourself that sounds totally made up, but is 100% real? I was at a store when Tony Hawk was signing autographs. I was only 10 at the time, and was a huge fan. One of his early video games had just come out. The store had a couple TVs on the wall and some video games to play. Being a kid, I waited for one controller to open up and someone leave. A kid ended up leaving, and I grabbed the controller and started playing and minding my own business. A couple minutes later, the store wanted to grab photos of Tony playing his own video game. He came over and grabbed the second controller and began to play multiplayer with me. Probably played for 10 minutes. The bonus was it was also my 10th birthday. So I played Tony Hawk Pro Skater with Tony Hawk. Nice try sneaking that BS in at the end. We all know you were turning 11. Nice. Once in college, I applied for a job at the library help desk. I figured I would help people find books. Didn't give it much more thought than that. During the interview, I aced all of the customer service questions. Then they asked me whether I knew how to defrag a hard drive. Cue alarm bells in my head, but I kept calm outwardly and said no, but you can teach me. I worked in it for 3 years by accident. They were too nice to fire me. I made my last boss swear on her life she wouldn't call me for tech support. They call my cell when I'm sick in bed and ask how to reinstall the printer not a dang week later. It's always the printers that get you. You can be a 55-year-old CTO, but when then CEO's printer stops working, you're the one who has to open it up and pretend like anyone knows how to fix a printer. I once successfully ran an unfunded shelter for roughly 100 homeless veterans as a homeless civilian. How did this come to be, if I may ask? I lost my job and housing in early 2017. I'd been homeless before and slept rough on the streets, although that was in California, where the weather was at least bearable. This time I was living in North Dakota, and I'd seen what the winters were like. I figured if I was going to have to sleep on the streets again, I'd better move somewhere where I didn't have to contend with hypothermia for a good part of the year, so used the last of my money to relocate to Arizona. I had a totally impractical plan of finding work, and then housing within a few weeks before my remaining funds ran out, but the deadline came and went, and I found myself on the streets again. A homeless advocate I'd reached out to tried to get me sheltered at a place for homeless veterans, but being a civilian, they turned me away. Aforementioned advocate reached an accommodation with the veterans by setting up an overpass shelter for homeless civilians next door that I would run for him. In exchange, I would be allowed to sleep on their property, outside the walls, use their facilities like showers and bathrooms, and join in their communal meals, if they had enough food. Because the civilian shelter was an overpass thing, I really didn't have much to do, or anywhere to go, in the day, so I spent more and more time with the vets. I took it on myself to help them with odd jobs like security, packing lunches for the local homeless, who couldn't live with them, to come and get, unloading donations from concerned citizens, and security, fire watch while the camp slept at night. I soon became the camp's unofficial official cook, which was awesome, because I love cooking, and it was a challenge cooking meals for so many people so quickly, using an outdoor kitchen with bare bones facilities. I gradually began to take on more responsibilities with the vets, and the overpass shelter was more like a side gig. The vets repeatedly asked me to move into the walls and stay with them, making me full-time, but I refused at first because I felt like it would be letting down the guy who I was running the overpass shelter for. I woke up one day to see the vets dismantling the tent we used for the overpass shelter, and one of them wryly asked me, "Where are you going to stay now?" I moved in with the guys later that day. A couple of months later, the incumbent base commander and his family had secured housing for themselves, and he didn't ask as much as tell me I would be taking over for them. They had thought about who was going to take on the job after they left, and decided I was apparently the only one fit for the role, due to my diligence and enthusiasm for helping my newfound friends. NGL, there were parts of it that were tough and really grated. I felt like I had to constantly prove myself to the big peen swinging mentality veterans, who felt that, as a veterans camp, it should have been run by a vet. I was also just as homeless as my men. We had nothing but tent fabric. to protect us from the element, sometimes little food or water, and constant issues with the local tweakers and criminal element of the homeless. But helping these people get off the streets and or reunited with their families is hands down one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done in life. I took my mother for a surprise trip to New York City. She got married to my father there in '68. The surprise was manufactured by way of telling her we were going to Australia. We live in New Zealand, so a trip to Australia is not a huge deal. It's the type of thing you could do for the weekend, and therefore she packed a bag and brought her passport. We got to the airport and said, surprise, we are going to New York, and she cried her eyes out with delight. When we arrived on our first morning, I said, okay, what do you want to do? She said, when I was last here, in 1968, the Twin Towers weren't complete, so I'd like to go to the top of them. Your wish is my command. I said, and off we went to the WTC. That was the afternoon of September 10th, 2001. Suffice it to say, there was a particular poignancy when we looked out the window at around 8 AM the next morning. Wish you could see my chills. Literal chills. I once won a $500 raffle during a routine visit to my local tea shop. It was the building's annual Black Friday event and there were 5 baskets with varying amounts of goods, services, and coupons. I needed tea, so my only stop was the tea shop. It cost me $20 to fill my tins, but they said raffle tickets were given out after a $25 purchase. I said hell to it and got a hot tea for me, and the woman in line behind me entered with that one ticket. I got a call a few days later saying I won the top prize basket. When I went to claim, they asked about my purchases. I told them, and they said the drawings had over 1,000 tickets and many people had over a dozen entries. The raffle prize included $25 to the tea shop. I once won an expensive blanket in a raffle at work. The raffle was for charity and they bugged me to enter, so I bought one $1 ticket, while all the older work ladies bought 5 or 10, because they really wanted the blanket. I was the only person at the department store who only bought one ticket. This was in the early 90s, and I was only making $4.10 an hour 20 to 25 hours a week, and that dollar came out of my gas money. The day of the drawing I sat in the break room, and as I passed by the blanket I thought, I better not forget to take that home tonight. I snorted in disbelief at the silly thought, and went off to do work. A couple hours later I was informed that I had won the blanket, and yes, I was freaked out, and yes, I remembered to take it home. I was born 12 weeks early and was nearly born earlier. My mom had a weak uterus from endo, so they had to push me back and stitch her up. The doctors told my parents to expect me to be unable to breathe, walk, etc. on my own. The doctor performing the C-section nearly dropped in surprise at how hard I was screaming and flailing. I do have a few health problems, but it could have been much worse. I just imagine that baby screams translate to put me back frickers. You did it once, you can do it again. My great-grandfather worked in the textile business and started importing rayon fabric from Japan in the late 60s and 70s. Keep in mind this was during the early days of synthetic fabrics, and traveling to Japan was not all that common. On a business trip, he met some Japanese businessmen who were selling newly designed transistor radios. His contacts wanted to set up an exclusive import agreement for their electronics to North America, but my great-grandfather declined, because how many of these radios could you possibly sell? Turns out that was a short-sighted business decision, because that company was called Sony Electronics. He turned down the exclusive import contract for Sony. On the other side of my family, my Canadian relatives walked away from 100 acres of land in Alberta during the Dust Bowl and Great Depression. They decided it was not worth paying the taxes on their land. Turns out that land was right in the heart of the Alberta oil deposits. Also on my mother's side of the family, they used to have a citrus orchard near Los Angeles. They sold it cheap to some land developers. That farm was right at Hollywood and Vine. My family on both sides is bad at seeing long-term investments. So, dump any stocks recently. I died first, and then was born. I've told this story a few times on Reddit, but I enjoy telling it, so here we go again. During the cesarean to bring me into the world, there was some major complication on my mother's end. She started bleeding internally, drowning me in the womb. When I was removed, the doctors tried to get me breathing but couldn't. I was declared dead. My mother was still unconscious, but my dad was brought in to say goodbye to me. He held me in his arms, was saying goodbye when out of nowhere I started coughing up blood and screaming as babies do. Apparently it was the weirdest moment in his life, being abjectly terrified and overwhelmed with joy that I was alive. It's my favorite story to tell, because weirdly it takes some pressures off on birthdays. I don't do well with too much attention by family/friends, but celebrating my death day doesn't bring people the same connotations. My great-grandma ran a brothel back at the turn of the 20th century. She was Algonquin and people were pretty racist back then, so she had a hard time getting business. Since it was a coastal town, Maine, she bought up a couple leaky old row boats and would load them up with hookers and booze and row them out to the ships at night. When ships came in to port, most of the crew would get shore leave and hit the bars and brothels in town, but they always had to leave a few sailors on the ship to keep an eye on it. My great-grandmother figured those guys had money too and probably felt left out. She basically set up water-based lot lizards, or Uber hoes. My grandpa and his sisters grew up in the brothel and no one would talk to them or socialize with them. My grandpa met my grandma picking green beans for a local farmer. They fell in love. When they wanted to get married they had to leave the state to get away from her family that were utterly disgusted that she would marry the son of a whore. So they ran off to Detroit because GM was hiring, and that's how my family came to Michigan. There was a successful manga series in Japan where I was the main character. Real life name, looks, clothes and everything. I didn't know it at the time, but my new friend was a very famous manga artist and we had several adventures together. More like I showcased my city/country off while they were visiting. Anyways, about a year after the author returned to Japan, I receive a parcel in the mail and inside was the signed first episode of the manga. The series became a hit and several more were made. Not about me. My mother moved to a third world country when she was little. Her father tried to auction her off to potential husbands, but she escaped with the local's drug dealer. Married him, had my sister. Sister almost died of pneumonia. She wanted to leave him. He tried to shoot her. She fought him and escaped with sister. Met a millionaire, had my brother. Had 3 miscarriages, and it turned out his ex-girlfriend had cursed my mom and there was a voodoo doll of her in the garden, buried underneath. They burned the doll, my mom got pregnant. Millionaire man didn't want the child, hired men to kill mother. Mother escaped to home country with kids, heavily pregnant. Had my brother, worked for a while, met my dad through an ad. Turns out he'd been in prison for the 20th time, and wanted a companion. They married, had me and my brother, got divorced cause dad became an alcoholic. Got married again, and divorced this year. I swear, most of my friends don't believe a word when I tell them about my family, until my mom tells them. Just to make sure I read this correctly. 1 child, sister, with local drug dealer. 2 children, brothers, and 3 miscarriages with millionaire man. 2 children, you and brother, with your father. Sounds like your mom has had quite an extraordinary life. I hope she's well. Nobody knows why I'm half blind, not even who. I went blind in my left eye when I was 7. My optic nerve atrophied. There is no explanation as to why. I have had everything tested and my body was at the time completely normal. I've had plenty of tests, met far too many experts. I've had several specialists come to hospitals near me to inspect me and all sorts, and I've had far too many tests and the answer is, well, it just happened, we guess. There's plenty more. My life kind of reads like some kind of awful sitcom or something, but the eye thing is the easiest to digest. When I was in primary school, I was one of the smartest kids in school. I got straight A's on every test, could do math without needing a pen and paper, and had an IQ of 150 with potential to reach 170 as I got older. Because of this, I always ended up going on special field trips and doing advanced classes and tests. I was also getting letters. I would get letters from special camps, colleges, and even some universities. One letter was from DC. They were picking gifted children to meet the president. I was one of the ones picked. Of course I never got to go. My family was very poor and my stepfather was an abusive asshole. One of the reasons that this is unbelievable is that I'm not smart anymore. Even after getting away from my stepfather, I still dealt with PTSD, anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts. I fell behind in school and my grades suffered. Then my mom's health got worse, and I dropped out of school to get a job. Now I'm 20, and I'm just now overcoming my mental problems, and I'm working towards getting my JED. I had a speech class in college, and had to do a speech on any topic of my choosing in front of the class with a PowerPoint and everything. The night before I had absolutely nothing, not even an idea what to speak about. It's now 5 AM the day of the presentation and still nothing, and I'm desperately trying to think of something to BS for this, and then it hits me. I will BS a speech and PowerPoint in like 3 hours about how to get away with blabbing a speech. For example, my speech's second point was to simply restate everything using different phrasing, classic technique, and my third point was literally the same phrase differently to illustrate the point. It was funny seeing the class slowly realize what was happening on that part, cause many were surprisingly slow on the uptake. I also included a slide from my previous speech's PowerPoint about surviving bear attacks in Florida, on purpose to make it even shoddier. Afterwards I walked to the teacher who was instantly grading us afterwards, and he gave me an A. I literally turned to the class and was like, holy crap, I can't believe that worked. Thankfully my best friend was in that class, so I have a witness and honestly I wouldn't have been comfortable enough to do it otherwise. My old apartment building had 6 apartments in it. We were all low income, living paycheck to paycheck. Our landlord was the meanest woman I have ever met. She was racist, homophobic, and downright cruel. Over the years, she just became a nightmare. One day, she gathers all of the tenants up in the parking lot and handed us all eviction notices. We were literally all in one large group, learning that we were all gonna be homeless in 30 days. There was an 80-year-old woman named Thelma, who lived across the hall. She was old and had no living family members. She was gonna end up homeless. My dad and sister both have multiple sclerosis. I was basically the only one who could move our belongings in 30 days. After work, we were gonna have to live with my uncle until we found a place. There was a single mother raising her son in the apartment below us. We were all going to be homeless, and the landlord didn't care. We all had 30 days to leave the building. She was raising the rent by $300 and renovating the entire place. She had the balls to show us the type of appliances she was putting in our apartments. She said we were all the saddest tenants she ever dealt with. My father talked to the landlord and asked if she would reconsider the eviction at all, due to the fact that all of the tenants were struggling. She pretty much laughed in his face and said she was going to Vegas for the weekend and won't be accepting pity phone calls. Cut to October 3rd, 2017. I get home from work. My dad is watching the TV with a crazy look of astonishment on his face. He reads the victim list of the Las Vegas shooting. Our landlord was one of the 58 poor souls that were gunned down. We were in a total state of shock 3 days after the woman evicts 6 lower income families from an apartment building. She is gunned down during a Las Vegas country music concert. She was a straight up nasty cruel evil person, but she didn't deserve to die. She was somebody's mother, daughter, wife. My life changed from that moment on. I was afraid that if I treated someone poorly or was mean to them, that karma would get me. I was depressed and riddled with anxiety. My life changed at that moment.